Morning, everybody. How are we all doing? I hope we're all doing okay. Some thumbs up. Yeah, all good, all good. Fabulous. Happy Friday indeed, Jan. Just put it in the chat. So this week we are going to be going over a little bit of what we did last week, looking at some stuff this week as well. And I'm going to warn you now, I am going to need a willing volunteer. And if I don't have a willing volunteer, I'll have an unwilling volunteer. Okay, I will pick somebody at random from the whoever is there. So just warning you now, okay? But don't worry, it's a nice volunteer thing that I'm going to ask you to do. So I'm going to share my screen, which means we have to do the can everybody see my screen moment? Okay, let me see if it works. So can everybody see my screen? Let's have some thumbs up, nods. Perfect. So we are planning our podcast episodes this week. Okay, last week we explored why you're creating a podcast, explored what success looks like, examined some of our podcast titles, and we mapped out our podcast foundations. And if you're thinking, gosh, Charlotte, this sounds a lot like a teacher, I've been doing some lecturing recently at a local university. So I did set your homework as well. That's me being a teacher, if I was a little model there. I did set you some homework. So who has got their 6 to 10 topic ideas? Are you an A? Yes, and I've also bought you an apple, Charlotte. B, I started, but that's a technical term. My students use that quite a bit. Or are you a C? My dog ate my homework. And if you are a C, my dog ate my homework, you have to show your dog on screen, I'm afraid. That's the rule. So we've got some A's. Oh, Catriona, never mind, don't worry. Oh, look at all these A's. B's are absolutely fine as well. A, Kerry's A, B, and C. Kerry, you can't put that in the chat and not come on and tell me how you're A, B, and C, please. Oh, come on. I'd love to know.
So what this led to was a total overhaul of the information that we present on the website, which is a good thing. Like we're redoing. I work for a charity called Birmingham Community Matters, and that gets people together who have got ideas to start community groups to talk to people who've got experience doing that. So you're kind of learning from one another. And we're setting out our resources page on our website of like starting a community group, from like having an idea through to like getting a bank account, getting people involved. So it's sort of by going through the podcast process, it's made me think about how we present that information. So I had started, but it's led to a whole new like content audit. So yeah, which is a good thing.
I almost feel like I should apologise for all the extra work
no, it's
got on now, Kerry.
But thank you.
No worries. Right. If you're an A or a B, absolutely fine. If you're a C, do you know what? That's absolutely fine as well. You can still be part of this session, okay? So it was kind of mean for me to set that homework, but actually you're going to gain more if you've got those topics. If you haven't got those topics, I'm pretty sure you can come up with one idea between now and when we get going on this, okay? If not, this is where my willing or unwilling volunteer is going to come into play. So we need, I've done, in case you don't know what 10 looks like, I've put it up here. So our 10 maximum at the moment topic ideas. Look at all these people who weren't here last week, but you're here this week. I'm very impressed. You'll love last week. It was great. So 6 to 10 episode topics. If you've got one of those and you're willing to be a volunteer, let me know in the chat. This is where it all goes silent, isn't it? Who am I going to pick on?
Very fantastic opportunity.
We will basically be going through we will plan your episode, but we're all going to do it together. So you're not just going to be on your own. I promise you. I will be going through it and we'll get other people involved as well. So even if you're not the willing volunteer, you will be able to come off mic as well. So anyone? Dave's got a few ideas. He's put that in the chat and I'm now going to make him my willing volunteer. Dave, are you happy to be my volunteer? Silence.
Yes, but may run off occasionally because of him.
Who have you got? Oh my goodness, we've got a dog. That's even better. So we're going to map out our first podcast episode. And there's 4 things we need to keep in mind when we're planning our episodes. We need to know what is the key point of the podcast. Now, when I say podcast, I mean the whole thing. not the episode. So we went through last week what the point of our podcast was. What are we doing this for? What does success look like? So we need to keep that in mind when we are thinking out what we're doing with our episodes. Bearing that in mind, we need to know, what is the podcast not about? It's equally important as what the podcast is about. So, for example, if you were doing a podcast that you were setting up to be a method of engaging with new potential supporters, you wouldn't necessarily want to be talking about industry trends. As much as it's interesting to people within the industry, if you're reaching out to get supporters, you want to be talking about what they are interested in and what they want to hear. How are you going to keep the listener listening? How are you going to make it interesting? Why is it going to be worth their time listening? Because remember, we spoke last week about time being that really, really valuable commodity that we've all just got a very limited amount of time, and we have to make sure that we are giving the listener something valuable in return for their time. And then lastly, we need to just keep in mind, what is the key takeaway you want your listener to have remembered at the end of the episode? So what is that little golden nugget, that little thing in their head that you want to keep in their head? Sometimes you listen to the radio if you're in your car and you're driving wherever you're driving to, and you get there, but you can't stop listening to whatever is on the radio because you've just got that either a sense of something or a really interesting story. You kind of want that takeaway at the end. So you either want them to be amazed at something they've said, hit in the heart by something they've said, or you just want them to know what they're going to do next. Okay, so you just keep in mind, what is that takeaway that you want? Is there a golden line you want them to remember? Is it that they're going to remember, right, I'm going to sign up to this email list because that's where I'm going to get more information? What is that one key thing? It's going to be different potentially for different episodes that you do. It's also going to be different depending on what podcast you're doing. So those things in mind. This is the kind of thing that we want to do. Now, this is the generic planning your episode bit. You're going to get a workbook at the end of this session, which is my podcast planning toolkit. And in there, you'll find a little bit more of a breakdown to if you are doing a solo episode, an episode with a co-host, or an episode with a guest. But generally, these are the things you want to do when you are doing your planning your podcast episode. So Dave, if you're okay to come on, are you okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. You've got your co-host with you.
Sorry, what's the question?
I was just joking about your dog being your co-host.
Yes.
You'd be amazed how many podcasts I edit which have cats and dogs involved by accident.
I have to believe that.
So you said you've got a few topics or episode topics ready to go.
Yes.
I'd like you to choose one of those, please. So which one are we going to choose? It doesn't have to be episode 1. It can be episode whichever you want. But which one do you think would be a good one to just start planning out now?
So the basic ideas of the podcast, just take a step back, is kind of taking people through an interview process.
Yep.
So let's go for one, looking at the greeting when you arrive at an interview.
Oh, I like it. So what is the objective of this episode? And if this sounds like a lesson plan, it's because it is very much like a lesson plan. So what is the objective of the episode? What is the whole point of doing this episode?
It's to introduce, it's to basically tell people the best way to kind of introduce themselves at a job interview. And
then what are the main points that we're going to cover?
So it'll be like shaking hands, talking about themselves, making sure they kind of repeating people's names, things like that.
Excellent. And why are these points important? And why are they important now for this episode?
So this will be kind of probably the second or third episode in the series. It's going through kind of an interview, looking kind of doing kind of 10 to 15 minute snippet little podcasts.
Perfect.
They're important because it's your first contact with the interviewer face to face. Obviously, we are still working on in person. We are going to be covering virtual interviews as well and how there are differences. And it's important now because it's to help people kind of prepare themselves for an interview.
And why are these points important for your listener? Are they brand new to interviewing processes? Are they?
Not necessarily. So the charity I work for, we work in the employability sphere. We work with a lot of people, a lot of different people. So the idea behind it is just to kind of introduce them to the best practice for an interview, I suppose, what to do, what not to do. So that's why it's kind of important in going through all the different stages of an interview, from kind of pre-interview to post-interview and follow-up.
Brilliant stuff. How do you want your listener to feel at the end of the episode?
Informed, positive, happy that they're able to kind of do what's being introduced during the episode.
Confident and empowered. Yeah. Great stuff. And are you going to have a call to action for your listener? Are you going to ask them to do something next? That could be anything from an email, sort of, sign up to email, sign up to a forum, sign up to a Facebook group, or it could just be go out and practice this.
It'd be more practicing it and kind of moving on to the next episode, which will then be the next stage of the interview.
Great stuff. Great stuff. So there are other bits that we would look into here as well. We would want to know, obviously, you gave us the background on that, but essentially these are the main points to cover. And I always say it's good to have main points to cover, but you need to understand why these points are important and why they are important now. Now can be either the timing that the episode's going out is in the season or the quarter or the month that the episode's going out, or it could be now as in the structure of the podcast series. Why is it going in episode 3 and not episode 5? So if you can answer those questions, you're going to be absolutely flying. Now, if you're doing a guest or an interview, then you would still want those main points to cover and why these points are important and why they're important now. But then I would also get you to write down the questions you're going to ask with the same question underneath. Why are these questions important? And why are they important now? Okay, so I'm going to get you all. You saw how quick and easy that was for Dave. And Dave, thank you very much. Really do appreciate you stepping up and being my unwilling volunteer. So I'm going to ask you all now to do this. Plan your first episode. It doesn't have to be episode number 1 in your series. It can be episode whichever you want. If you haven't got a topic, then I want you to do your introduction episode. Okay, so if you've got no topics in mind, I want you to do your introduction episode for me. Okay, so I'm going to give you all 10 minutes. So we'll come back at 11:30. It's 18 minutes past 11 now. We'll come back at 11:30 and we will get you to plan that episode for me. And like I say, it's not going into detail. It's just sort of almost like a lesson plan is the easiest way to describe it. If you've got any questions, put them in the chat and I will answer them as I see them while you're doing these 10 minutes. So off you go. Plan that episode for me, please. Okay, I'm coming back quite quietly just to not make you all jump like I did last week quite a bit. So how did you find that? You can put it in the chat, or if you want to be brave and unmute yourself and just let me know how that was for you. Did you get at least one episode done in that time? Just started the planning. Got a plan for an episode. Well done, Jennifer. That's brilliant. One basic intro episode done. Well done, Paul. Dave went well. Brilliant. Fantastic. So you can see that it feels really methodical, I know, and it feels maybe like a bit too much, but by having these down, you're going to make sure that you are getting yourself organized, like Melody has just put. And it just means that you're going to be on topic all the time. We spoke last week about what podcasts we liked, what podcasts we didn't like, and the ones we didn't like were the ones that waffled on. Remember, the ones that didn't seem to know what they were talking about or weren't really talking to us. This is just a really good way of making sure that we're staying on topic and talking to the people we want to talk to. And Dave really likes the structure. Fabulous. Really pleased that it's useful for you. And it's good. I do this with every episode I write. Oh, the cat has come to visit. That door should have been shut. Sorry about this. He's the executive producer. His name is Buddy, and he probably will cut us off in a second. Oh, now you can see the wall collapse. Apologies. Shut my door. I fed him before we started so he wouldn't come up and be annoying. Apologies for that. I do, there's going back. We can't edit this. Oh, heck, I'm just going to disappear very quickly and get rid of him. 2 seconds. I'm also going to mute so you don't hear me call him the names I call him.
He's getting in trouble.
He's in, look at him again. Honestly, the names he gets called.
That's the illusion just been broken as well. It's not a colourful brick wall, it's a sheet.
Oh, there's all such a good lie that this is a real wall and everything.
That's what I was saying. You've broken the illusion.
I know.
You told us last week it was just a sheet.
I know, but
Yeah.
some people weren't here last week, were they? Anyway, happens to us all. And like I say, my cat has appeared on my podcast because he's jumped up before and started meowing into the microphone. So so this is just a really good way of planning your thoughts down, making sure that you're not repeating yourself in different episodes and you're talking about the right stuff at the right time. And if you talk about the right stuff at the right time, you're going to be talking to the right people as well. So that's really the key thing. It's about making sure it works. Now, I know some of you are going to be doing solo episodes potentially. Some of you are going to be doing interview episodes. We're going to go through a couple of bits about guest episodes, having guests on your episodes. But what I'm going to talk about is actually can be used very easily for when you're doing your own episodes as well. So don't just go, well, this isn't for me. Think about the stuff that we're talking about and how you can use it for you if you're doing a solo episode. So guests on podcasts, what's the point? Can anyone tell me why you might want to have a guest on your podcast?
Someone that's knowledgeable.
Yeah, someone who's knowledgeable.
To address a current issue, that's something that's more burning.
Yeah. Credibility, expert opinion, interesting story, new perspective. That's all coming in the chat. Bringing new audiences. Yeah, that's not a bad one. Yeah, they're mainly the reasons. Discuss a specialist topic. Yeah, all good reasons. Now I say you've basically got 2 types of guest. You've got an expert and you've got your case study. However, it's not as clear cut as expert and case study, because I think they overlap sometimes as well. Your expert can quite happily be your case study, because your case study can be your expert in that thing. So let's look at these 2 a bit more in more detail. But before we do that, you've also got your contributors as well. They kind of aren't your expert, but they're not your case study either. These could be people that come on a regular basis, potentially. So you sometimes hear on radio shows, they'll have newspaper reviewers. They're not necessarily experts on a newspaper, but they have a contribution to add. Film reviewers, that kind of thing. Now, you might want to have someone on your podcast that just comes and brings in their perspective of the week. They're not necessarily an expert that you're interviewing. They're not necessarily a case study that you're interviewing. They could just be someone who's got something to say. They can be a contributor. So the expert. So this is not a dictionary definition. This is a Charlotte Foster definition. The expert is the guest who knows more than you about a particular subject. Now, I think we all get hung up on the word expert, that to be an expert, you have to have lots of letters after your name, maybe even a doctor in front of your name, and lots of qualifications and lots of everything. You need to know everything, or, you know, have the official certificates that you know everything. No, they don't actually have to do that, but they do need to know their stuff. And you'll use expert guests when you need to explain something that's out of your expertise. So yeah, they add some credibility, and they add that that knowledge that you don't necessarily have. And then the case study is really, you know, somebody who's gone through, or is going through, or is experienced, or is experiencing what you're talking about. You would have a case study on your podcast when you want to illustrate a point, find out more about how they did something or what they've experienced. They might be an eyewitness. They might be someone who's going through a program that you're offering. Anything that's that kind of that lived experience sort of thing. And what case study guests do is they add an extra level of storytelling, but they also add another level of credibility and variety as well. And it almost adds authority to your podcast because you've got a case study to show off. How do we get the best out of our guests? Just remember this: boring questions will get you boring answers. When I was in radio, there were a couple of things we dreaded the most, but one of the things that could be sprung on us on a daily basis was the dreaded vox pop. That's the bit where you go out into the street and ask someone in the public just a question, usually a question that most people cannot answer because it's way out of their scope. They're not the experts. I think the most famous vox pop answer is, it was at the 2019 general election. John Kay from BBC, the BBC West correspondent, went out, and it was a general election had been called, and he saw Brenda from Bristol. And I think we've all know Brenda from Bristol. She's the one that, when John Kay said there's going to be another general election, stuck his microphone in her face, and she went, "Oh no, not another one!" And that's been memed to heck, hasn't it? But that's an example of a vox pop. He asked a boring question, got a particularly boring answer, but it wasn't. It was just used quite cleverly. How do we make sure we don't get boring questions and boring answers? We do a little bit different. That's how we do. But we don't forget the basics while we're at it. So I've jazzed up the basics here. Have we all heard of the 5 W's and the H? No? Brilliant. So the 5 W's and the H, I have to count them out, otherwise I can't do it. So the W's are who, what, why, when, and where. And the H is how. So if you can get those bits out of your guest, you're going to have a good basic interview. You're going to get everything you need to get the information across. But we don't want them to be just basic. We want them to be jazzy. And that's what I've done here with the illustrations. They're jazzy, right? So how can we do that? Any ideas about how we can get better questions to do so that we can get better answers? Anyone got any ideas? Ask open questions. Absolutely ask an open question. With vox pops or children, if you ask a closed question, it's going to get a yes or a no answer. You will get a yes or a no answer. Carrie, research your guests and ask specific questions. Fabulous. Good answer. You need to do your research. Absolutely. Yeah, basically it is generally you do your research, but there's some other tricks that we can have up our sleeve as well to make sure that we don't just get boring questions for boring answers. So where are we going to find our interesting questions? We are going to do our research. We are going to look online. We're going to read what they've written. We're going to listen to what they've done already, and we're going to watch what they've done already. Forums such as Reddit, great place, Philip, really good answer there. So when I say read what they've written, I mean go on their social media. Obviously, only their public social media. You can only go what's in public. But if you go on their social media and you find that what they've been tweeting about, that's a really good way of doing it. You can, I got working with a client, and we were doing a bit of research, interview prep for her, and we looked on this person's Twitter feed. Quite a high up person in the NHS, with doctors, GPs in particular. And this person had put on their Twitter feed about how they'd spent the whole weekend watching Come Dine With Me and Married at First Sight Australia. So we asked, as well as asking about the important questions about the NHS and what GPs are going through at the moment, we also asked them about, tell me about your Come Dine With Me and Married at First Sight Australia addiction, please, because you tweeted about it a lot. And we got a fantastic and interesting answer from that they'd never spoken about it before. And they said it was what they used to kind of just have that de-stress moment. And, sometimes, and how bingeable it was. And she wouldn't necessarily recommend she does it every weekend, but it was just a new answer that she'd never, ever said before. So that was interesting. And we got that because we had a little nose. Be nosy. You can also go on whatever podcasts they've been on, if they've been on a lot of podcasts. And what you need to do is listen to the questions that have been asked and think how many times they've answered those questions. And can you ask a different question? So it's tricky, but it's about asking the questions that haven't been asked before. And you can only do that by looking at what they've done already. So we also mentioned, Philip said forums. Absolutely. I'd go and have a look around on different forums. What are people saying about them? Have a real dig deep about what's going on. Now, this is only useful if someone is known as such. This is your expert. So if it is your case study, how do you get stuff out of them, particularly if they are new to coming on a podcast? It's someone that, it might be someone that you're working with or someone that you've helped, in which case it's time for a conversation. And I would do this with the expert as well. Every guest you should have a pre-interview conversation with. One that is not that you're being recorded for. It's just a conversation. Listen to what they say. Ask them some questions. And then you might get some new questions from what they've answered. So rather than doing this in the interview, do it beforehand. This is one of the things that we do a lot. I did a lot when I worked in radio, certainly when I was at 5 Live and in local BBC radio as well. We would make sure we had a chat with each and every guest before they went on air to know what they were going to say so that we could write the best questions to get the best answers from them. So it's almost like a dry run, but it doesn't have to be as long. 10, 15 minutes is all it really needs to be. So you don't need to sort of worry about having a lot of time put aside to it. What I tend to do with people, if it's going to be a remote recording, is I say this is just a dry run for us to do ahead of the interview. Make sure the tech works your end and you're comfortable using the tech as well, because that's quite often a way of getting people on board to doing this chat. So Katie's just asked if I would do that a few days before. Absolutely, get it done a couple of days in advance so that you can then plan your podcast questions. If you can't do it face to face, I say face to face in real life, so either on the remote recording that you're going to use or on the phone, what you can do is send them an email or send them a Google Doc, a Google form is one of the things I use to get a few bits of information from them. And one of the questions I always ask people is there a question you've never been asked before, but you've been dying to be asked? What, and not would you like £1 million, obviously, because I'd like to be someone to ask me that question. The answer is yes, I would love £1 million. Thank you very much. They're kind of just to dig around a little bit more. So the preparation is really key. So it's do your research, both the public stuff they've put online, but also speak to them ahead of time. It's also really good speaking to someone ahead of time because you can put their nerves at ease a little bit as well, especially if they're not used to being on a podcast. So you can ring them up and talk to them. And then if they've got any questions about what's going to happen, you can explain all that to them as well. The next thing you can do to get a really good question, to really get a really good answer, is say absolutely nothing. So you've asked them a question, they've given their answer, say nothing. If you want more from that answer that they're not giving, just shut up, because they will absolutely 100% break before you break when it comes to saying something. Nobody likes silence, especially me. You can tell that I talk a lot. Nobody likes silence. And if you don't say anything, they will keep talking because it's uncomfortable for them not to keep talking. So you can possibly get the real answer after they've given you their prepared in their head answer. So by saying nothing, you can get more from somebody. And lastly, I always ask you, I said, we were doing that planning, we need to, have some questions written down, ready to go. Be prepared to rip those questions up and ask a different question. If A, you're not getting the answers you want, or B, you've got an answer you are quite surprised about, weren't expecting at all, and you want to follow up, because that's what you do in a conversation, wouldn't you? You would go to somebody talking about something and they say something that you weren't expecting. You'd go, oh, hang on a minute. Tell me more about that, because that wasn't what I was expecting, and tell them it wasn't what you're expecting to hear. So have that conversation. There's a real tendency, I feel, when you've got guests on podcasts to make it almost like a question and answer session rather than a conversation. And what we want is a conversation, because the best podcasts are those where I'm listening and I'm feeling like I'm having a little earwig on the coffee in a coffee shop at the table next to me, and I'm just sort of like leaning in. And I can feel myself do that on some interview podcasts. I'm just going, I literally just start leaning in just to hear a little bit more. So you want your podcasts, when you've got guests, to feel a little bit like that conversation that you're listening into. Does anyone have any questions about this? Oh, Minnie, is there a different technique needed if you're going to edit out the interviewer? Do you want to come on microphone for me? Because I'd like to have a little chat with you about this, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I just was thinking that I think some of the experts, not quite sure about the structure yet, but we might not have like my voice or the producer's voice asking the questions left in the final recording. We might sort of use those as prompts and then sort of, I think, splice things together into a kind of a commentary.
Okay, so would you have like a voiceover introducing them?
Yeah.
And then almost like, so someone's like a narrator going through it. So the person who's doing the interview isn't necessarily going to be the person speaking on the podcast. Is that what we're getting at?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. I just wanted to make sure I understood it. Yes and no. You want to get the best out of someone. Sometimes your voice isn't going to be on there. So what you would need to do is just be aware that you're not going to be able to necessarily dive in and interrupt somebody when they're speaking. If they've got something good to say, or you want to challenge, sometimes you want to challenge guests when you're talking to them. If you know that your voice isn't going to be on there, you really can't interrupt those guests in the same way, because you can't, it's hard to put that through together. Unless, of course, you said the person doing the voiceover, the narrator person said, my colleague Minnie did the interview, and when this, and she, you'll hear her voice a couple of times during this bit, but there's no real different technique, but you just need to bear in mind that you don't want to be interrupting your guest, essentially. But you probably want to warn your guest, because guests like to use your name a lot to try and make them, especially if they've been media trained. If somebody has been media trained, they will use your name a lot. It's that whole kind of making sure that you've warmed to them and all that kind of stuff. So tell the guest, I'm not going to be I'm just doing the interview. Please don't use my name. It sounds really rude when you put it like that, but you don't have to put it just like that. So tell the guest, it's always about being upfront. So tell them, this is an interview, it's going to be for a podcast, it's going to be edited. I would always tell people it's going to be edited if you're going to edit it. I'm not going to be the person that presents the podcast, so you won't hear, so the listener's not going to hear my voice. So we're just going and just explain every single sort of part alongside what you're doing. But there's no real different technique needed. You would just possibly be a little bit more gaps in between. You wouldn't want to speak over your guest at any point when you're talking to them. Does that help, Minnie?
Yeah, I was just typing. Really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
You're allowed to type. You're allowed to type and make notes. I love it. Fabulous stuff.
Thanks very much.
Does anybody else have any questions? So I said that this could be used for the same stuff, if you weren't having guests. And basically for this, you just need to substitute guests for your topic. So again, it's about where you're looking for your research. I know you can't have a phone call with your topic, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say you do that, but it's about where you're looking for your topic. What stuff has been said? What stuff hasn't been said? Why hasn't it been said? What are people saying about it? What are you saying about it? And it's about finding those different places where there is information about what you want to be talking about, and bringing that to your research and knowing what you're going to say. Now, you might want to look, when you're doing your research, at books, and you might want to look at podcasts and films or other stuff. Here is kind of some issues around copyright. Now, I'm going to say this very loud and very clear. I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. Please don't sue me or anybody connected to me when I come to telling you this. But generally, when it comes to copyright, if you haven't written it, you can't use it. If it's not yours, you cannot use it. You'll hear people go, but there's fair usage. Unfortunately, podcasts are global. So fair usage is different in every single country. And if you have the time, energy, and effort to be able to deal with a fair usage claim in Australia, America, Britain, then go ahead, try and get away with fair usage, but they're all different. So you cannot pick up a book. I haven't got a book to hand. I did have to put it away, thinking I was being timed out. You cannot pick up a book and read out a chapter and ask someone, what do you think of this? What you can do is you can pick up a book, summarize that chapter and say, what do you think of this? Really difficult sometimes to explain that to people, but it's the same, if there was a poem, if you haven't written that poem, you cannot read out that poem and go, what do you think of this? What you could do is say, whoever the author of that poem is, in the poem, poem X, they talk about these themes, they're important here, kind of thing. You couldn't read out the poem and then go, and obviously those themes are here, here, and here. Does that make sense as well? I'm just trying to steer you away from getting sued for copyright, although generally it just then starts with a cease and desist, but nobody wants to deal with any of those nasty letters. Okay, so you can use those for your research, just don't read them out on your podcast. So there we go. And now I just want to talk about the structure of a podcast, because I've written this intro, outro. That is pretty much it for when it comes to the structure of a podcast. There is that lovely gap in the middle for you to do what you want, which is both brilliant because you've got that freedom, but also look at those blank spaces, those blank pages. What are we going to do to fill those in? Lots of things we can do to fill those in. But before we're going to do that, I want to talk to you about intros and outros. Okay. Intros. It's as obvious as your introduction to your episode. And your outro, it's as obvious as the out section of your podcast. I generally say to people to have a scripted intro and a scripted outro, because they're like your bookends. Your introduction and your outro. They need to kind of signal the start and they need to signal the end of your podcast for the people that are listening. If you can have the same words at the beginning and the end, it's a comforter. People know that it's beginning and the end. Do you have to have theme music? No, you don't have to have theme music. You can if you want to. And there's lots of places, having just given you a warning about not using stuff you don't own, there's lots of places you can go to get music. You can either buy a license for a couple of dollars, or you can get them for free. I will talk to you about that next week. But you don't need to have any music at the beginning or the end of your podcast. There are plenty that don't. There are plenty that do, and the reasons for having the music at the beginning, it kind of is a signal to somebody. We're very used to having music at the beginning of programs on the telly, and some programs on the radio as well. So if it fits your branding, absolutely put some music on. When it comes to music, and I'll go over this next week a million times because it's one of my absolute bugbears. When it comes to music, if you're putting music on and you're speaking on top of that music, the music can never be too quiet. In fact, 9 times out of 10, your music level is too loud and people can't hear you. But I will talk about more of that next week. You want to make sure you can be heard over your intro. And I would keep your intro around 30 to 60 seconds long. Any longer than that, and people will skip through it every single week, especially if it's the same every single week. I would make sure that your intro just tells people about the podcast, not the episode, and you and you. Then at the beginning of each episode, do not repeat your intro. So your intro is the bit where you go, hello, welcome to my podcast. I am Charlotte. And in this podcast, we look at the big picture themes of whatever those are. And then you would start your episode. I know you're starting your episode. So your intro is your start, but then you start your weekly bit as such with not another hello, because you've already said hello. You would then do your guest introduction. So intros are generally 30 to 40 seconds long, introducing the podcast as a whole. You're then going into your episode start, making sure you're not repeating what you've done in the intro. So it could just be, this week I am talking to whoever. This week I am talking about whatever. Then again, we've got those blank spaces. Then we come to the outro. The outro bit is where you say, thank you for listening and what you want them to do. So for me, I generally wanted people to join my mailing list, or where they can find you. So find us your website or your socials, whatever you want people to do. And just do that as your intro and your outro. So in the middle, we can either do a mixture of, or just on their own. We can do an interview. We can do an interview. We can do a chat with somebody who isn't necessarily a guest. Who is a contributor. We can just have our own chat on our own, our monologue. We can do features. We can do pretty much anything you like. But how do we make sure it is not dull? Apart from not repeating your intro and your outro in your middle bit, there's lots of things we can do. So one of my clients, as an example of something interesting we could do, one of my clients was really annoyed at there's lots of myths going around their industry. And they said, oh, I just like a bit of an icebreaker when we talk to our guest to make sure, just to sort of get them warmed up, get them loosened up a little bit. Maybe we could do like a myth buster thing. Great. So basically in preparation, their guest had to come up with the myth that they get really annoyed about the most in their industry, tell them, explain the myth, and then explain why it's a myth, kind of thing. So do that little myth busting, the thing that annoys them. Another client, we came up with the idea of, as a way of like an introduction icebreaker bit, they had a game of their own version of Cards Against Humanity. Now, Cards Against Humanity is quite rude, so they were making it their own version of their own, with their own brand, but it was the Cards Against and then the industry that they were working on, which, don't laugh, was residential lettings. So Cards Against Residential Lettings was the version they were doing, just to kind of make a bit of a thing about it and make a bit of a joke, but it became their thing. Other ways that you could do it is, I'm going to very much show my age here. When I grew up reading Smash Hits magazine, I remember they had like a biscuit tin, which they had, a figurative biscuit tin, I'm pretty sure. In my mind as a young 8, 9, 10-year-old, I thought this biscuit tin was real and that every band would do it. No, they clearly got it sent to, you know, a list of questions sent to them over the phone or whatever. But anyway, they had this pretend biscuit tin with questions in, and you could do that with a guest as well. So have a set of questions that you have come up with yourself, or you could get some of your community to set up for you, or just people that you know, ask questions, and then get a guest to pick a question out that they then have to answer. And then, you know, it's a nice sort of icebreaker. Somebody else I know has a feature that this is for business owners. They did this. You had to drink a glass of water and tell them your favorite business tool, and the feature was tool or drool, as if whether you could understand what they were doing. Now, what they're doing with that is they are repelling people that wouldn't ever work with them because in one easy swoop, or also bringing people in that they think, oh, this is funny, I'd like to work with them. So it's all about making it interesting and surprising, and there is no fixed kind of structure to the podcast. So time to get your thinking caps on again. You've had half an hour of not having to think too hard and just listen to me and not the cat. I want you to come up in the next 5 minutes. Let's make it really difficult for you. In the next 5 minutes, a way that you can either do an icebreaker or a feature for your podcast it doesn't have to be bonkers crazy out there. You know, it can just be as simple as asking a question or getting a question sent in from your community and you answering it. Just some way that you're going to disrupt your podcast episode to make it different to what everybody else is doing out there. Does that sound quite scary and horrible? Because there's some horrified faces I can see. Just a little think about what you can do that's going to make your podcast different to what everyone else is doing. You've got till 5 past. Okay, it's 5 past. I was tight on time on this one, but it's just mainly to get you to think about what you can do to not have the same format and structure that everybody else does. Has anyone got any ideas that they'd happily share? And just as another aside, there's no such thing as a brand new idea. So if you want to steal an idea, as long as it's not, a complete rip-off of what someone else has done, like, adapt it for yourself, then absolutely do that. When we used to do that on radio all the time, but just sort of tweak a little bit. So Luke, rose, thorn, bud, a woe from the day, a joy from the day, something you are looking forward to today. I like that, Luke. Brilliant. Suzanne, down at the bottom of my garden is, oh, yes, I'm going to keep all of these for my own. I'm joking, I'm not really. These are brilliant though, well done. We'd like to have listeners send in voice notes that we can feature, crowdsource the content. Dave, that's a great idea, and I will show you how you can do that next week. It's definitely possible. Celebrity dinner date. Oh yeah. Can you tell me work? I'd love to work in a botanic garden. It sounds lovely. Luke, that's brilliant. Danielle, favorite childhood game when you were younger? Yes. Suzanne, a blast from the past, best high school memory of a science lesson. Rory Anderson, 2 truths and a lie. Yes. Peters, my first, my last, my everything. First something, last something, and what you want most if money was not an object. Dave, what's your secret culinary weapon? These are all lovely. And do you know what? You're going to get surprising answers from other people as well. I did notice a quick question that Katie had put about telling the guests about these before the interview. Yes, I would, but I wouldn't necessarily tell them every single thing about it. If it's something as ridiculous as I'm going to get you to drink a glass of water and then explain your favorite business tool to me, then yes, I would tell them that, to do that, because you want, you want them to be up for it. And if they're really, really not up for it, then it just becomes horrible and awkward, and it doesn't make anyone feel good at all. You feel bad, they feel bad. So you pre-warn them that. But you might just say, we're going to have a couple of icebreaker questions, if you wouldn't mind taking part in that. If you wanted them to come up with a myth busting thing, then they're going to need to do that beforehand. It's really difficult to come up with some of those things on the spot. We're going to play cards against residential lettings. You would probably say, we're just going to do a bit of a game to start with. Are you up for it? Obviously with podcasts, they can be edited, but you don't want to set your interview off in a bad way or finish it on a bad note. So you'd make sure. Guests will quite often, while we're talking about what we tell guests ahead of time, there are certain things that you really should tell your guest. So you should tell your guest you need to tell your guest that it's being recorded, what editing it's going to be is likely to happen, where the podcast is going to be put out. So it's going to be, if you're doing a private stream, it's only going to be within our community or in our company or in our organization. If it's going global, you need to tell your guests, this is a podcast, it's going out online on the internet, it can be accessed throughout the world. You need to tell your guests what type of editing you're going to do. Is it going to be a long chunk, or is it just going to be a couple of minutes of what they say? You need to tell the guests if they're going to be up against somebody to start with. So if you've got a couple of guests, or if they're going to be put on a guest, if you're going to have guests that are going to say something completely opposite to them, you just need to give them that picture so that they're not misrepresented. You also need to give them a kind of an overview of what the podcast is about. So this is a really extreme example, but it's a really clear one to make. Say you were doing a podcast about vaccines, and this was a very clear pro-vaccine guest that you had. If while you were doing your podcast, you changed to kind of, you were changing from a pros and cons or, pro-vaccine science to then become an anti-vaccine podcast, you would have to tell that guest who's come on that actually we're focusing on the anti-vax side of things, because it changes the rule, the sort of the terms that they came on. Okay, that's mainly for like your series or your documentary type ones, but in general you just need to tell people what the kind of podcast is, what the podcast is going to be about, just so that they know if they want their name with the podcast. Now for 99.9% of you, I don't think that's going to be an issue whatsoever. You're not going to be too controversial or anything, but it's just polite just to give them a bit of what you've done. A lot of guests will go, are there any what's the word? Are there? Can you tell me a list of questions you're going to ask? And at this point, I always say no. And I say no because what you want to do is A, get them on that chat beforehand, and B, if you tell them a list of questions, 9 times out of 10, they will only answer those questions because they'll have them written down. They'll have their answers ready, prepared, written down, and they'll read them out like they're reading out written words rather than having that conversation. And also, if you then decide that one of those answers comes up with a brand new question for you, and you answer that brand new question, they'll go, hang on a minute, you said you didn't say you're going to ask me that question. This is a new question. I've not prepared it. So what you can do instead is you can give them topics and areas of discussion. So you can say, right, I want to talk to you in and around the topic of podcast making. We'll look at planning. We'll probably look at what research goes into a podcast, that kind of thing. And then I usually add a little bit at the end where I say, but it's a conversation. So these things can, just develop into that kind of, you might say something that surprises me and I'll ask you a bit of extra question. But then I'll also go, but don't worry, it's edited. So if there is a question that I've asked you that is not in your remit, we can edit all of that out. So nobody knows that question's been asked and you said no. Okay, so you're giving people that power and that control. But it is kind of polite to let people know that it's a podcast that's being recorded, it's going where it's going to be heard. And also, if you're planning on using your podcast as a basis for other content, so a blog, LinkedIn posts, Instagram, social media posts in general, or just content on your website, it's also good to sort of say to them, by the way, we'll also probably use some of what you say potentially on our other channels, so our social media or our blogs and our website, because then nobody's surprised. I had it a few times on, again, worked in radio. Somebody was on a local radio station, did an interview. So the person that did whatever they said was so good, the clip got sent across the BBC, because that's what we did. We shared information, shared interviews. And then that clip got picked up by 5 Live, and 5 Live used it in their bulletins. Somebody they knew heard them on 5 Live, rang them up and said, I've just heard you on 5 Live. And they went, but I've not been on 5 Live. This is outrageous. What's going on? They didn't fully understand. So it's just about giving people the knowledge so that there's no surprises. Nobody likes a bad surprise. Yeah. It wasn't a bad surprise, but it was a surprise for them, and they just needed a bit of extra talking. What else have we got? Oh, Kerry, that's interesting that you were given a list of questions before going on a podcast. It made you nervous. Yeah, absolutely. So definitely want you to be, nobody wants to be nervous. Having that, and again, I think sometimes having that informal chat ahead of time helps end the nerves as well. What other questions do we have? Alan, when we were interviewing our guest, we ended up only asking 2 questions from our list as they felt it was too formal and wanted to just see where it went. Ended up being a fantastic interview that was far longer than our original planned 30 minutes. Yeah, that happens. This is what I kind of like about it. You're not constrained by time in the traditional sense, that you can go off and have those conversations and see where they go. And that's really what I want you to get from these 2 sessions, of where we're structuring and where we're planning our podcast, is a bit of planning, a bit of forethought can lead to these beautiful conversations coming and growing and just becoming, what they are. So this is the only thing I'm going to give you when it comes to structure of a podcast. Have an intro to introduce and set the scene. Have an outro to, again, conclude what you've done. They don't have to be the same each week, but they can be the same each week. Oh, I just love podcasts. The answer is always, it depends. But make sure you do have that intro and that outro. And in the middle, let your imagination go wild, because you can. And it's much more fun that way. However, don't be overwhelmed by those blank pages. We have a list of things there that you can do to just disrupt your podcast there, disrupt the structure of it, and make it a little bit more different to what is out there. So that's it for today. You will be glad that I'm going to stop talking now, and I will stop staring my screen, and the cat is well and truly locked away as well, you'll be pleased to know. So I'll let Jen do the finishing bit, but yeah, thank you very much, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Charlotte. And yeah, really hope that was a useful session for everyone. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to stop the recording, and we're here until 12:30, and we'll have just be kind of a smaller discussion. You can come in and bring your questions. I'm just signing you up for that, Charlotte. I'm hoping you're happy with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or if there's anything about your own specific ideas that you want to have a chat about, we'll do that. I'm just going to pop a link in the chat to the excuse me. What's going on with my voice today? The upcoming training sessions that we have, mainly to point out the third part of this workshop. If you haven't already, please do sign up for part 3, where we'll be looking at more. It's entitled "Getting Your Podcast Heard." So we're going to be looking at the kind of specific tools, aren't we, Charlotte, around getting your podcast into production.
So I'm going to go through. It's going to be really techie, but not bad techie, if that makes sense. So, but I'm giving you the different tools that are out there that you can use that are on the cheap end of cheap. So there'll be some free things so that we can get our podcast on Apple, get it on Spotify, get it everywhere it needs to go. So how to use your hosting, transcribing your podcast, why that's useful, and how you can get that done as cheaply as possible. Editing, because I know that that's a thing. Well, is it a thing? But how to do that? There's free tools we can use for that, and there's some really useful tools that we can use for that as well that are just brilliant for people that don't want to spend hours editing their podcasts, and nobody does, believe you me. I think I spent 10 hours editing last week, and it frazzled my brain. And there's also tools that you can use for social media tricks that we can use with the podcast. We're getting the most from our podcast as well. So I will send a kit list as well, because there's going to be a lot of different website addresses that I'm going to put out there. So I'll send a kit list, and I do the toolkit. How can I get the toolkit to you?
You should be able to drop it in the chat just now, but also if you ping it to me, I'll do a follow-up email and just circulate that around everybody who's here.
Let me see.
Just on your question, Zoe, yes, the recording of the first session is on that training page as well. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see previous workshop recordings, so you'll get it there.
Cool. So the Suzanne, would you normally include a trailer for your next episode in the outro? You don't have to. It's a nice thing to do. Say next week we'll be doing this and this. It doesn't have to be a pre-recorded trailer. You can just be so when we call this like a talk up. Literally, you just talk about what you're going to do. So you could just have a little talk up, and next week we'll do this. So hook and tease people into what you're doing. If you've got a clip of somebody from the next episode, put that in, like a nice little 15-second kind of headline. Like, women's magazines are really good at this. You look at the front cover of those terrible magazines, you know, the ones I'm talking about, not the celebrity ones, the ones that have real life stories in them, and they'll pay you 500 quid for those stories or whatever it is. They're really good at that little hook and tease on that front cover. They'll go, shock, horror, my son is actually my husband's dog twice, or something, or my daughter ran away with my husband and now I'm my aunt, or something along those lines. You look at those and you go, oh, I really want to know more about that. I really want to know more about that. Well, I do, because I am that trashy and I don't care. But it's that kind of hook and tease that you want to do, because you want to have a little nose, if nothing else, just to make yourself feel better about your life. Obviously, we want people to listen to the next episode of the podcast. So putting a coming up in a really nice little hook and tease like that, maybe a little less salacious, is a great way of getting people to listen to your next episode. And so, it's a good thing to do. I am struggling to get the podcast up then. Let me see if I can just talk amongst yourselves.
I'll just hit stop recording now.